Hey everyone, I just wanted to say great work on the second discussion, the discussion for Unit 3. I enjoyed reading all of your responses, and let me just say again, the kind of overarching comment that I give in feedback is to remember to include specific cited references to the readings or the videos to stand as evidence for your ideas. So if you have any questions about what I mean by that, please ask and let me know. That's one of the things that we're working on specifically in this discussion board for this class is using historical evidence to support our ideas as we respond to certain questions. Um, all right, so that said, I wanted to make a few different comments from things that kind of stuck out to me as I was reading through this discussion board. And so I'll be consulting my notes over here from time to time. But the first thing that I wanted to mention is something that I posted on a little bit of detail in the thread that was created by Jessica. So if you're interested in reading more, please go there. Um, but there was a really good discussion there about slavery and the role of Africans in starting the slave trade. And something that we need to remember with Africa, as with indigenous peoples in the Americas, is that for us to say that Africans betrayed other Africans, um, it's accurate, but it doesn't quite capture the realities of what was going on in that place and time. And what I mean is that African people were very different. There were different groups, there were different tribes, there were different nations, there were different religious traditions, there were different societal traditions, and so to treat them as though they were all the same people and that they saw themselves as that, they saw themselves as united, or that they saw any good reason to be united. Doesn't really capture the reality of that historical moment. Just to give an example from a little closer to home in New Mexico history, in the mid 1500s, and then again at the turn of the 1600s, when Spaniards came to explore and then colonize and enacted great violence here amongst the Pueblo people. Um, so there's still that notion with like a smaller group of Pueblos that they should have somehow been united. And the problem comes from the terms. We call them Pueblos because that's what the Spaniards called them because they lived in villages. But the reality was they had different traditions, they had different languages, and they did not see themselves as united. They didn't see any reason necessarily to be united, and even some of them supported the Spaniards. Again, they threw their support to the Spaniards for a variety of different reasons. Sometimes it was because they could get leverage for ongoing conflicts with other groups, with other Puebloan groups. Um, Sometimes they just figured that it was best to sort of hitch a wagon to the new imperial power in the area, to protect, or at least as an attempt to protect their traditions and their life ways. They would find that that wasn't quite the case of what was going to happen. But this brings us to a couple of other points that a few of us raised. One was the notion of indigenous allies as a key factor for explaining how the Spaniards were so successful. And I think this is one that Restall and Lane really help us to understand was vital to the early conquests, although it's one that doesn't get as much attention as things like disease or technology. Elsewhere, Restall has pointed out that in terms of technology, the Spaniards who enacted the conquests in Central America, in Mesoamerica, Mexico City, um, or in Peru, they didn't actually have that much technology with them. It was somewhat advanced, but their weapons were slow. It took a while to reload, and so the technological advantage that we sometimes allow them is probably a bit overstated. It was there, not to say it wasn't there, but it's probably a bit overstated. And so kind of dividing and conquering, building alliances with groups of indigenous people who could help them fight um, against others and conquer others was key, no matter where we're looking at, whether it was among the Pueblos or whether it was the conquest of the Aztecs. Um, and so I wanted just to point that out, that we shouldn't minimize the role of Indios Amigos in the conquest. Another question that was raised was the role of religion. I think here again we need to make sure that we have some nuance in the way that we're thinking about things. So just to say that religion was an excuse or a cover for violence and greed doesn't quite capture the ways in which Spaniards in the 15th, 16th centuries thought about Catholicism and their relationship to it. As we kind of see with Patricia Seed's piece, um, even among the friars, so even among people like Montesinos and Las Casas, who have reputations for being champions of indigenous rights, they still saw indigenous people as inferior. They still saw them as human beings only in relationship to their capacity to be able to convert to Catholicism and adopt European ways of thinking about religion and civilization. Um, and so even if they thought, these are people who have rights, these are people who shouldn't be subjected to horrible, brutal violence, they weren't necessarily even averse to violence, though, at least in certain ways or certain contexts. Because if there were cases where indigenous peoples would not convert or adhere to the new Christian standards, oftentimes friars felt like violence was totally justified because it was a small price for them to pay in order for their eternal salvation. Of course, friars gained politically, economically as well from their efforts in the Americas. But I guess what I'm saying is that there's this notion that we have of separating Christianity from economic or political pursuits, and I think that's a good thing. I'm all for it. And I said Christianity, but that could go for any religion. I'm just thinking of the case of the conquests. But that's not the way people thought then. And that's something I guess I'm trying to hammer home here, is that we kind of have to put aside the way that we see the world, think about how and why people saw it differently during the period of conquest, and then what does that help us understand about the conquest. By doing this, it's not to justify their actions or say that it was okay that they used violence. Although another question that comes to my mind is, could there be a conquest? And again, conquest meaning subjugating another entire civilization or group of people and trying to make them adhere to your ways of doing things. Can that ever happen without violence? Whether it's a religious conquest, a economic conquest, or a political conquest, are there any cases where that could happen without violence? And I don't know that it could, at least if we're thinking of the term conquest rather than cooperation or some sort of working together. So I think this will transition to the last point I wanted to touch on, in the framework of saying that also we need to think about how the questions that historians ask, or that we ask if we're thinking about the final project, how the questions we ask will limit the kinds of things that we talk about or look at. And so this question was raised in Ashley's questions and comments about Zheng He and Columbus. Of course, I think John Green makes a very good point that Columbus is not the best sailor, and this is also apparent in the textbook as well. Columbus was a horrible administrator. Queen Isabella had him arrested. His fortunes dried up very quickly, but he's still remembered because he, whether by just fortune or good luck, or because he had a good idea, whatever it was, his efforts initiated this period of conquest that we're studying, that initiated the creation of this place called Latin America. Again, for better or worse, it's still okay to recognize that he played a role in that, and also be critical of that role, and also say, it led to, even genocides, the erasure, attempted erasure of indigenous cultures, and so on. And I think one of the reasons that people like Zheng He are not remembered is because their efforts kind of quietly went away. It didn't spur on a wide-scale or large-scale colonization and conquest effort on the part of the Chinese for various reasons. So again, and a lot of you pointed this out in the bonus question, Chris did, and in one of her responses, Sophia did, that we still need to recognize people's historical significance or historical roles, but we can be critical of them. We can understand that maybe they shouldn't be mythologized, as Chris said. And there's a fine line there sometimes. And so here at the end of my comments, I just want you to remember that sometimes with historical figures, well, probably all the time, it's too simple to call someone a hero or say that they were all good. We're humans. People do horrible things, they also do great things, and sometimes they have both of those inside of them. Both of those things manifest from them at different points in their lives or different times in their actions. And so we need to treat people in the past in that same way, with that same kind of complexity. I would also suggest that if you see a historical account or you try to give a historical explanation that only relies on one variable or one cause for something, that should throw up some red flags. You should be skeptical of that. It's never one thing. Even with the case of why were the Spaniards able to conquer such vast civilizations, with that question, the answer relies on various different things. And so just please keep that in mind. And also, I want to reward those of you who have watched this to the very end, because this is longer than I usually try to make my videos. I want to offer some extra credit. So I'm going to pose a couple of questions here relative to some of the ideas that I raised. And if you want to respond, I'm going to post this as an announcement, but I'm also going to post it in the discussion board as well in Unit 3. If you want to just respond to this one in Unit 3, in that thread that I created, that would be fine. So for up to 30 points extra credit, if you use at least one specific citation from readings or videos, please address the question of what examples can you think of things that we mythologize in history? So I'm thinking about Columbus. But what other people or ideas do we mythologize in history, and why do you think we mythologize them, and how can we overcome that? The other question that I wanted to ask, or that you can respond to, is do you think that conquest could be enacted without violence? So, and why or why not? I'll give some examples for that. And I think that is all. So again, let me just end on this notion that the questions you ask can determine the kinds of responses that you get. If your question's too narrow or focused on a specific region, then you're only going to hear about Columbus. So this is also going back to Zheng He. If you're focused on world history and economic encounters, Zheng He, of course, will appear as an important figure. If you narrow your focus, the way that Restall and Lane did, to looking at the antecedents of European cultures in Latin America, then we focus on Columbus and focus on that element of it. That's not to say neither one's wrong, but what we get are different perspectives. And so, again, it might be that some authors just want to write for shock value or for interest or excitement, and you should watch out for that. But also it might just be that some authors, they can't write about everything in history, and that's a problem that we have, but it's very real. You can't write about every single thing, or you would never finish your book, or you would never finish your movie, or whatever it is. So sometimes it just has to do with the kind of analysis that they're doing, and the kinds of questions that they ask to focus that analysis. So again, I'll leave it there. Thank you if you stayed with me this long. If you have any questions about the way that I posed that extra credit, please let me know, and I hope that you enjoy moving on to Unit 4.